Last Friday marked the 7th anniversary of the historic Brexit referendum. On June 23rd in 2016, a slim majority of Britons voted for their country to leave the EU, which was formally completed at the beginning of 2020. In view of the loss of prosperity, it is now dawning on many citizens of the United Kingdom that their vote against remaining in the European Union was probably wrong. And even Brexit champion Nigel Farage recently admitted that leaving the EU was a failure. We have not benefited economically from Brexit, although we could have. That's what the ex-leader of the UKIP, the UK Independence Party, said on BBC television. And he said Brexit was a failure. Observers in the EU even speak of an economic disaster for Great Britain. In any case, the island kingdom had promised a lot for its economy after the exit. Despite a trade pact with the EU, however, trade barriers have increased, of course, and in addition, hope for trade agreements with the USA, for example, have not yet materialized and are a long way off. And most recently, less than 2/3 of the foreign trade volume was covered by post-Brexit trade agreements. After all, the ability as a sovereign state to conclude its own trade agreements free of EU regulations was one of the key promises made as part of Brexit. Now that the UK is no longer part of the single market and the customs union, a host of new rules apply to UK companies exporting to the EU. Extensive customs formalities are required for exports, and for smaller companies in particular, the financial and organizational effort is so high that many of them have stopped exporting to the EU. And this is probably also the main reason why bilateral trade between the UK and the EU is a mess. As a study by the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin shows, the volume of British exports to the Union is 16% lower as a result of Brexit. Imports from the EU, on the other hand, are about a fifth lower than without Brexit. And another not insignificant point is there's a problem with investments in Great Britain. After the 2016 referendum, they stalled massively due to the many imponderables surrounding Brexit. And the London think tank UK in a Changing Europe states in an analysis that the volume of investments would have been a quarter higher without Brexit. The consequences of the lack of investment will probably only become noticeable in many areas over a number of years, but they are already having a major impact in one sector, and that's the automotive industry. Last year, the number of cars made in Britain fell to the lowest since 1956, and the reasons were difficulties in the supply chains and plant closures, and the latter are associated with Brexit. The labor shortage, which is particularly acute in Great Britain, is also causing growth-inhibiting effects. Experts such as Paul Johnson, director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, see the trigger for this as being, among other things, Brexit, which makes immigration from the EU considerably more difficult. In many areas such as gastronomy or logistics, there is a shortage of workers. And previously, these professions were exercised by EU citizens. However, many of these reoriented themselves during the pandemic and in the wake of Brexit, and the British government's restrictive visa policy in many cases further accelerated the process. High inflation, which is proving to be particularly stubborn, it unexpectedly stayed at 8.7% in May, is not only due to significantly higher energy costs, but also to a certain extent to Brexit. There are still bottlenecks, for example, with food. And from the point of view of many experts, these bottlenecks are the result of the trade hurdles caused by Brexit. If the supply is scarce, then that drives up the prices. And in fighting inflation, the British Central Bank accelerated its pace on Thursday with a surprisingly strong interest rate hike. As they announced, they raised the key interest rate by 0.5 percentage point to 5%. That's the highest level since 2008. You might have heard it in my other video. And most economists had only expected 0.25 percentage point, but it was the 13th rate hike in a row. And at the same time, the monetary watchdogs are ready to continue their rapid monetary policy march. The Bank of England has been trying for a good year and a half, that's much longer than the European Central Bank, for example, to contain the alarmingly high inflation, so far with moderate success. The recently registered 8.7% inflation is the highest among the major Western industrialized countries. And as I said before, our food prices are falling. And Brexit or not, the bottom line is that the British economy is holding up better than was thought until recently. While the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, pointed out the danger of a recession at the beginning of the year, it now sees this danger is largely averted. For this year, they now expect a moderate increase in gross domestic product of 0.4% after estimating a minus of 0.3% in April. The IMF cites several reasons for its economic forecast, which has now been corrected significantly upwards. And this includes the fact that demand is developing surprisingly well despite high inflation. This is also due to rising wages, government spending, and a brighter business climate. According to the head of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, the Conservative government in London has helped improve the economic situation in recent months with decisive and responsible steps. Well, I don't agree with the IMF there, but there's a different point. But according to the British Finance Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, the IMF's assessment shows that the economy is on the right track. However, high inflation and especially energy prices continue to pose a major challenge. And why I disagree with the IMF is that is nothing that will look good on the long term. Of course, it is the state aid for the energy costs that make people able to spend more money domestically. And the wage rises in some sectors as well, although there are still some sectors fighting. The domestic demand got higher now, and it still didn't lower the inflation prices. That is why there is a small growth. And that is the point. Here in Germany, people are still very careful. Our trolls and whataboutists always talk about Germany is in a recession. Yeah, but nobody is worried about it here, because we know that the main basis for it is that people are still careful because of the crisis. That is not over, but it's not hitting us as hard as the British, by the way. But Germans here obviously are more careful, and they are not spending that much money. They are keeping their money and guarding their money at the moment, and that is what's causing this minor recession here. So nobody is worried. There is tons of money. The people are not just spending it because they want to have a clear path, and the actions of our Social Democrat, Green, Liberal government here in Germany, which is a catastrophe at the moment, those actions have definitely a lot to do with that. Because people are now suddenly worried of having to spend 100,000 euros next year for a heat pump and whatever, because that was such a mess with bringing up this law. And there are some other things as well. People have absolutely no trust in this government at the moment. That is why we at the moment have so many people saying they would vote for right-wing extremists in the next election if there were elections now. This is because our government is messing up big time at the moment. And that's the same reason why people are not spending their money on just luxuries. And that is the reason for our recession. And that doesn't worry me. And that doesn't worry many people. That will change. But our government has to get a grip on their work and has to start working properly, and then the people's mood will change again, and then they will spend money, and our exports are doing fine. The supply chain trouble is much lower than it was during the COVID crisis and so on. So there are completely different reasons for certain developments in the UK and Germany, and that's why this whataboutism troll stuff that always comes up will not work. And as I said, the food prices in my supermarket are going downwards. The milk price is going downwards. And that's despite still having an inflation at around 5%, but it depends on what is the inflation. in Britain, have a look at the inflation on the food prices as well. And that's what hits the majority of the country. So you always have to look very carefully. But nevertheless, that's for today. If you want to know more about Brexit or other parts of UK politics, the next video is right in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.